Will the Denver Broncos look to make a splash on the outside at the wide receiver position in free agency or the NFL draft, or will they focus on their in-house development? We'll take a look at that and much more here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you know it is your team every single day. I want to give a special thank you and a shout out to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country, all the first listeners. Thank you for making us part of your day every single day, all year long, because for the true fan, there is never an off season. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos credentialed reporter for Mile High Sports, joined as always by Sayre Bedinger, longtime site expert over there, predominantlyorange.com, also a writer over there, NFL Spin Zone. He does it all. And we got a lot to break down here on today's episode of the show as we continue our position recap and preview series from 2024 at the wide receiver position. We'll wrap things up by asking a question, will the Broncos add a big-name wide receiver in the NFL draft or free agency? We'll also take a look at whether or not anyone in-house can emerge for the Broncos at that position opposite of Courtland Sutton. But in order to look forward, you got to look backwards. And we're going to kick things off on today's episode of the show by talking about the Broncos wide receivers that they already have in developmental mode and where they could go next. That's what 2024 was for this Broncos team. Sayre, I mean, when we look at this position, when we look at this room and all the things that made up Denver's offense in 2024, the wide receiver position might have been a saving grace outside of Bo Nix to this offense. But even though that was the case, there's still so many question marks about several players. And really, Courtland Sutton was the alpha dog once again.
Yeah, it was a really odd year from that perspective, right? It was like maybe one of the best years Courtland Sutton has had, obviously on the heels of the season that he had in 2023, where he set a career high in 10 touchdowns. And you had these young guys emerging at different times throughout the season, right? I mean, Devaughn Vele had his moments. Marvin Mims, certainly in the back half of the season, I think maybe the most consistent production outside of Courtland Sutton, but that was the sample size after the trade deadline. So that's kind of what we had. And then there was the occasional Troy Franklin game where he'd be gaining yards after the catch, or he'd make, a play here and there. And then we finally got that big play from him in the playoffs that we'd all been hoping for and trying to manifest throughout the season. But other than that, it was just kind of the occasional play from Lil Jordan Humphrey and not much else from this wide receiver room. And I think that a lot of fans would agree, Cody, that the Broncos kind of, shot themselves in the foot a little bit by cutting Tim Patrick. You had Josh Reynolds, and I think they kind of figured, well, we'll have Josh Reynolds on the team. He can kind of do what we thought maybe Tim Patrick could do, but with a little more juice deep down the field. Ultimately, they end up cutting Josh Reynolds and paving the way for the young guys to take all those snaps. And so that's the part of me that right now, as we kind of look back at last year, it really indicates to me maybe what the future holds for the Broncos in terms of them prioritizing player development.
Well, and I know one thing too, like Sean Payton said it last year, even at the beginning, our goal is to go out there to compete and win. Like we just don't want to be satisfied with, looking okay in certain spots. He says, we want to win the division. We want to get to the playoffs. That was the team's goal there. But I mean, I think when you look at their roster, the personnel decisions, you mentioned obviously for them, they brought in Josh Reynolds in free agency to move on from him in season. I think says something about, okay, we need to see where our development with these other guys like the Troy Franklins, the Devaughn Veles, the Marvin Mims is going to come into play. And yeah, to your point too, even about Lil Jordan Humphrey, like Lil Jordan Humphrey, I'll say this, underrated in a sense in terms of like, okay, he's a good blocker on the perimeter. He'll catch, a couple of passes here or there for you. But in terms of him being really widely featured, I definitely think that impacted a little bit of the early on development of Marvin Mims. I think it impacted Devaughn Vele. I think it impacted Troy Franklin this season. And certainly Sean Payton's got his allegiance to guys that he knows. And with Lil Jordan Humphrey, here's what Sean Payton will tell you. You know what you're getting almost every single time. And I understand that. But when you've got a guy like Troy Franklin, who you traded up for in the NFL draft because you want to see, like you got the speed, he's got the size, he's got the yard after the catch ability, you got to give him more opportunities. I think we saw that down the stretch here. Marvin Mims, they found a little bit more of an established role for him. And I think they're going to continue to build on that. Devaughn Vele at times, like there was a stretch of the season where he was Denver's wide receiver too. And that wasn't a bad thing because he's got the size, the athleticism. He can make those big catches with his catch radius, can box out smaller defenders. But ultimately, with the Broncos trying to figure out, hey, can Bo Nix lead us as a rookie? Can he showcase that he's the guy, being really the goal that you had going into 2024? Now it's like you could take that risk with, hey, we're going to get these younger guys more playing time here during the second half of the schedule so we can maybe see where we're at going into 2025. To me, that's all about player development. But, man, I agree with you, Sayre. You want to see more of it. You want to see more consistency. And I think one of those things that got in the way of the Broncos, I'd say, further developing some of these guys was maybe an allegiance to some guys that Sean Payton, has worked with previously, like a little bit of a pecking order. No matter what, I would have wanted to see more Devaughn Vele, Marvin Mims, Troy Franklin, Courtland Sutton as the primary 4 receivers.
100%, especially because that's kind of what ended up happening anyway over the course of the season. It's like, why not just dive headfirst into that at the beginning of the year? And so, I mean, I guess all things, kind of ended up being what they should have been. These young guys getting as many reps as possible. Marvin Mims finally getting involved after we had so many episodes during the beginning of the year where we were like, what the heck is this coaching staff doing with Marvin Mims? Like, we were wondering, were they hiding him during training camp in the preseason because he was so not involved? And so getting him involved was huge. But you mentioned it, Cody, trading up for Troy Franklin, who they said, Sean Payton specifically said, we had a second round grade on him going into the draft. And so you trade up to get him. You traded up for Marvin Mims in 2023. These are guys that you have prioritized from the brain trust, like the scouting department, the front office, the coaching staff. Like, you targeted these guys to be in this offense. And you've also rejected offers for day 2 picks for Courtland Sutton. And so I don't know. To me, like, as we get into this offseason, I can see the Broncos going so many different ways at receiver, but my gut is telling me that the guys that are currently on the roster are going to be the primary guys that they roll with going forward.
And look, I think you can also make some cases that can help you if you address other areas of your offense, right? If you have a legitimate run game, you've seen it. And look, Josh Allen's one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, but his supporting cast at wide receiver isn't necessarily the greatest. Is it better than Denver's? Maybe. Probably there's a little bit of an edge there because you got Amari Cooper, Keon Coleman, Khalil Shakir, who's obviously a talented player, and then Matt Collins, who does the dirty work for you. But I think like the upside with Denver, with Courtland Sutton as their main guy, with those 3 other guys that we mentioned, I think that there's a little bit more chance of there being a little more upside with these guys if they can get to a point where their player development, according to the front office, gets to where they think it can. And that's something even George Payton acknowledged in the end of the year press conference. He talked about how important it is to develop players and how Sean Payton's a big believer in that, and how the front office, the scouting department, they believe in development. So it's not necessarily about, all right, we're going to get this guy and he's going to be an instant stud right away. You'd love to see those cases certainly happen. I mean, it happens for other teams around the NFL, but it's hard, and it's like, can you develop that player to get to that point? I think when you look at the traits of Vele, Franklin, Mims, yeah, they can get to that point. But it also comes with growing pains too. As you've talked about in the playoff games, Sayre, we saw a drop from Troy Franklin, but we also saw the long touchdown catch, right? It's something that that was I would say a gripe against Troy, throughout the entire season was drops or some missed opportunities, or there was times where Bo Nix overshot him. But for Devaughn Vele struggled with drops in the playoff game. He had 3 of them against the Buffalo Bills. And so it's like when you're going through the development process, you love to see the good things, but you also have to acknowledge that, hey, these guys are going to make mistakes. They're going to have rough patches. That's part of player development. And now I'm excited to see how it carries forward. But realistically, it opens up, as you mentioned, opportunities and possibility for Denver to look at any and every option to continue to build this offense around Bo Nix while he is on a rookie deal. And that really is going to set up the question here. Broncos country, can there be somebody in-house that emerges as a true wide receiver 2 threat that can impact and take their production to the next level here in 2025? Or are the Broncos going to look at the free agency route to be able to do just that? Maybe Tee Higgins. We'll break that down and much more here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's Locked On Broncos podcast is brought to you by our friends over there at Talkspace. And therapy, it's a game changer, and it can help manage stress. It can help you improve your sleep, and it can help you communicate more effectively with those around you. But finding the right therapist and fitting sessions into a busy schedule, it can be a challenge. And that's where Talkspace comes in handy. Talkspace, the leading virtual therapy provider, makes getting the help that you need easy, accessible, and best of all, affordable. With Talkspace, signing up is simple. You can match with a licensed therapist who fits your needs, usually within 48 hours. And it's convenient. You can have sessions from the comfort of your own home, at your coffee table, at your house, and you can even message your therapist between appointments. Plus, Talkspace, it's covered by many insurance plans. And for most insured members, there's a $0 copay. It's never been easier to prioritize mental health. I've done that, especially with working a high stress load job where you're doing so much, creating a lot of content, stress, anxiety. Those things are things that I've dealt with, that I've used therapy before myself. And as a listener of this podcast, you'll get $80 off your first month with Talkspace when you go to Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL and enter promo code SPACE80 to match with a licensed therapist today. Go to Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL and enter promo code SPACE80 to get $80 off your first month and show your support for the show. That's Talkspace.com/LockedOnNFL, promo code SPACE80.
Are the Denver Broncos going to look outside their own roster to upgrade wide receiver 2 this offseason? Are they going to look to maybe upgrade wide receiver 1? What is going on at this position going forward? Well, that's what we're going to talk about on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, Broncos Country. Don't be surprised if you see the Broncos bank on their young guys making more plays in 2025. But we're going to talk about all that and more on today's episode, and want to say thank you to every single one of you that makes Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you all so much. And hey, if you don't have us at the top of your algorithm already, if you don't have us at the top of your podcast feed already, hit subscribe so that happens, so you can become an everydayer here at Locked On Broncos. Cody, let's talk about this, because last year, this is kind of where I'm basing my logic, right? And it's not always going to be the same, but last year, the Broncos really banked on Jaquan McMillan, and Riley Moss being their guys at the cornerback positions opposite Pat Surtain. And I think that surprised a lot of people. Like, a lot of folks thought, well, the Broncos need to go out and they need to either draft somebody to play corner, or they need to sign somebody or trade for somebody. There were not a lot of fans that were saying, hey, Riley Moss, he's guaranteed to be the guy out there. The Broncos really banked on him being the guy, and they've done that at a number of positions. You could talk about edge as well, where they cut a number of veteran guys or traded some guys. I don't know. I just have this sneaking suspicion that Sean Payton believes that wide receiver 2, maybe even 1, maybe even 3, if you want to go all up and down the depth chart, I kind of feel like he might try to run it back at this position group.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. And certainly, like, to your points about the cornerback position last year and how we can make that parallel here for wide receiver, maybe going into the 2025 offseason. Look, I think that the front office, I think that the coaching staff, they're far more patient with their vision and understanding where they're going than sometimes maybe you or I can, or listeners in Broncos country feel about what they should or shouldn't do. But I think that's the process of it, right? We sit here and we're like, all right, hey, we're talking about how can they get better? How can they improve? Is it in-house? Is it out of house? Is it, the NFL draft where you're trying to, make guys homegrown players, get them to second contracts? Or is it just like, you know what? Let's let the process play out, because most of the time there's not just an easy button, a one-step solution that's going to solve all the problems. Though I think when you add certain pieces to the equation, offensively, defensively, from a personnel standpoint, that's when you maybe start to build momentum in terms of roster building or competing and getting stronger in areas you were weak in. At wide receiver, man, you got the speed factor of Marvin Mims. You've got the size and the speed factor of Troy Franklin. You've got the size and the catch radius there of Devaughn Vele. And I can't help but think to myself as well, if Denver adds a very good running back, which has been a subject of discussion here on the show for the last handful of episodes here, if you add that, and if you add a legitimate pass-catching tight end, does it allow those guys to grow even further? But then we've also thrown out the idea here, Sayre, on this show, and certainly I think it would open up opportunities for these guys to develop even more, but going out in free agency and maybe making a little bit of a big splash, right? Going out there and adding a guy. Look, I know there's some big names. I don't think there's a ton of big names necessarily that are going to come in and be game changers for you, but I think there are 2 names that would probably be the best fit in terms of, hey, you're going to go in free agency and try to sign a wide receiver. the big fish this offseason is going to be Tee Higgins, depending on what Cincinnati does to him, because obviously they got to choose between Jamar Chase, Tee Higgins, and they got a whole bunch of decisions. Do you franchise tag one and then try to lock up another guy with an extension? I mean, that's certainly a possibility. Tee Higgins is going to be the big fish. Chris Godwin, another available option, but all signs point to him going back to Tampa Bay. He loves it there. He loves Baker Mayfield. They're building something special in Tampa. So for me, it's how do the Broncos maybe add to this position without sacrificing the development of your young guys who you obviously think so highly of? I think that's one of the biggest questions here.
That is because you don't want to sacrifice their development. Now, year to year in the NFL, I think everybody assumes that like these teams, including the Broncos, are just looking to just instantly slap the upgrade button on every position that wasn't amazing in the previous season. And that's not the case. Like you and I talk about how development in the NFL is not always linear, and not every rookie is going to be Malik Neighbors. I mean, shoot, not even Marvin Harrison Jr. was as good as Malik Neighbors, the guy that was taken before him. So
yeah,
we're expecting Troy Franklin and even Devaughn Vele, who I know is 27 years old already. He'll be 28 late next season, obviously, and that's always a topic of discussion. So I think the Broncos will add to the position, and they should, but you have two younger guys in Marvin Mims Jr. and Troy Franklin that I think this team obviously really likes. They traded up to get both guys. And so to me, Cody, you either are going deep sea fishing this year, as in hey, let's go out and let's get something big. Like we're going for the marlin. We're going big game hunting, or you're staying back at the resort and we got plenty of options here. Let's just see if we can't find something that we like within what we already got. But you're going to do one of those two things. I don't think you're going to say, hey, let's go on let's go try to get at least a little bit of something. Enough with the Josh Reynolds type stuff. As much as would have loved to have seen him contribute to the offense, there's a reason that he was cut when he was healthy, right? Because the Broncos wanted to see more of Troy Franklin. They want more Vele. They wanted more Mims. Don't be doing that kind of stuff. Don't be going after the Juju Smith-Schusters of the world and things like that. That's a waste of time. Either draft somebody and go with your internal guys, or let's go deep sea fishing or big game hunting and go after the Tee Higgins or the Chris Godwin, or if you want to get real crazy, trade something for Devontae Adams for a year or something
Garrett Wilson.
Big. Garrett Wilson, go for a big type of move, as opposed to saying, well, let's just sprinkle this veteran here and this veteran. There could be some guys that could maybe help, but I just think either this team needs somebody who's proven, consistent, very good, going to immediately raise the floor, or they need to develop the guys that they have in-house and maybe make a splash in the NFL draft.
I think when you look at the numbers too of Denver on third down and the fact that Bo Nix's favorite go-to guy on third down was Courtland Sutton, I think screams from the rooftops that, hey, we need to at least maybe bring somebody else in to help in that situation. Or like I said, a tight end maybe solves that. A good run game and a good running back solves that dilemma a little bit there, because how pass happy Denver really was this season without an effective run game. You get one of those guys, I agree, it moves the needle for you, and it opens up more opportunities. Because look, what did we see down the stretch here from defenses? For Courtland Sutton, he'd get press coverage from a corner who would play most of the time outside leverage, and there would be a safety over the top. They would bracket Courtland consistently, and especially on third down the stretch. And so that's where you need another guy. And of course, you're putting a lot of trust into guys like Troy Franklin, Devaughn Vele, Marvin Mims out of the backfield, where it's all right, when you line Marvin up as a running back in the backfield, you get him in a matchup more than likely with an inside linebacker who's got to get out there to the flat, especially if you swing him out, right? But then we start to see teams, hey, third down, Marvin Mims in the backfield. All right, each side, alert, that, hey, if he goes to your side, it's probably going to him at this point. Versus I would like to see that evolve to Marvin, them moving him to the slot, close to the tight end or the offensive tackle, run routes, like short yardage routes, as you and I were talking about, instead of just the deep routes. Get him the ball in 3 to 4 yards with a slant or a drag, and then let him get yards after the catch here. Marvin's got the speed to be able to do that. Don't go with the end around handoff reverse that we have consistently seen. There's got to be variance here to it. And I think that one personnel move here, you add a big fish to the market. I think it helps the Broncos. I think it helps Mims, because then teams are no longer sitting there double teaming Courtland Sutton. Or if they are, now you got another guy, as we've seen with the Broncos when they took on the Bengals. You try to take away Jamar Chase, well, okay, there's Tee Higgins there for you. Like, you need that type of threat in today's NFL. And look, even the Chargers a couple of years ago had that with Keenan Allen and Mike Williams together. That's a dynamic that you see in today's NFL. You got A.J. Brown for the Philadelphia Eagles, granted, in Devontae Smith. You got two guys there. I'm trying to go through all the teams. Kansas City might be the anomaly. They got Travis Kelce, but he's not like, those wide receivers that we're talking about, but he's consistent. He's reliable. And you look at Buffalo. They've got Amari Cooper, Keon Coleman, but those guys aren't like some of the other top guys there, but they can contribute. But those other teams have other elements sprinkled in that allow them to have success and to thrive. Jaden Daniels has Terry McLaurin, and he's got Zach Ertz at the tight end position. And you got two running backs there in Washington that can do certain things. It all helps the offense flow together. And getting that for Bo Nix, I think, is going to help the offense be more efficient next season. And so really, Broncos country, that's going to lead us to our next biggest question here. Will the Broncos, will they add a big name wide receiver? We'll take a look at that. Or is the NFL draft the best path? We'll tell you why. They should be looking to broaden their horizons here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's Locked On Broncos podcast is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. And especially with the big game that's coming up, they got the kick of destiny. It's going to feature Peyton Manning and Eli Manning on there to see who's going to make that as the big game is ongoing. And right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. That's $300 to keep the action going. Championship weekend is here this week. You got the AFC and the NFC. Who's going to make it to the big game? Who's going to win these games respectively? You can do parlays between these two games, or you can even do a same game parlay where you look at one game, you put together anytime touchdown scores, you do props on yards passing, yards rushing, over-unders, things along that nature inside the FanDuel app. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no waiting around for your winnings. Whether you're betting on your favorite team or you're just looking to add some extra excitement to the playoffs, FanDuel, they've got you covered. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. The fourth quarter action of today's episode, Locked On Broncos, is here. And once again, I want to say thanks to all the everydayers out there in Broncos country. Thanks to the first listeners for making the show exactly what it is. And don't forget, we literally have a show for you every single weekday, Monday through Friday, all throughout the entire offseason. Because for the true fan, guess what? There is never an offseason. You want fresh, objective Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, more? Locked On Broncos, you get that here with Sayre Bedinger and myself here. All right, as we dive into the final portion of our wide receiver overview for the 2024 NFL season, now we're looking ahead here to 2025. We've talked about what the Broncos offense certainly needs at this position to be able to produce and go a little bit further in the NFL playoffs this upcoming season. If the Broncos do, in fact, get back there, that's going to be a big part of it. But how do the Broncos go about adding to this position, right? We've talked about player development and the guys that are in-house. We've talked about adding guys. But if you're going to add a name, is the NFL draft more appealing, or is it NFL free agency?
Well, Cody, to me, the strength of this NFL draft is at tight end, running back, defensive line. I would love to see the Broncos open themselves up to those three positions with their top three picks. However, there's some guys in this draft class that I think you could fall in love with pretty easily at wide receiver. And we're still in the very early beginning stages of draft evaluation, things like that. But you watch the national championship game, heck, you turn on any Ohio State game this year, you're always going to notice their wide receivers, right? And that's just annually at this point. Brian Hartline, the wide receivers coach there at Ohio State, I mean, the dude is printing out wide receivers like it's just easy. He's just making it rain out there with these NFL caliber guys. And Egbuka, the wide receiver from Ohio State, looks like the ideal kind of fit for what the Broncos need. Can play inside and out, loves to block, all those sorts of things, has strong hands, really good in the red zone. That's the kind of guy that I would spend a first-round pick on. Obviously, Luther Burden from Missouri is another top-tier name. Don't think the Broncos are going to be able to get McMillan from Arizona. He's probably going to be way off the board by the time they pick. But there's some options, I think, in the draft that, okay, you want to go with this youth movement. You want to bank on Troy Franklin. You want to bank on Marvin Mims. I think those guys could be, a dynamic group with a first round receiver, and then obviously Courtland Sutton, as time goes along, you move on from him? Or do you replace Sutton this year with somebody like a like Cody? If you, like I said before, if you can get Tee Higgins and it costs you Courtland Sutton, are you doing that? Like, if you have to pick one or the other, are you taking Tee Higgins, or are you taking the guy that built chemistry with Bo Nix? Like, that's a big question mark. Or are you taking Chris Godwin coming off another ACL injury, right? And so those guys could fit. Those guys could be exciting. They would sell a lot of jerseys. But at the same time, is it exactly what the Broncos need right now, or does it help them in the NFL draft?
It's a great question, and there's so many different things to ponder. Like, if Denver were to look at bringing in an outside name, look, I think Tee Higgins is the only option that I would be interested in pursuing, in free agency. Or if you're going to try to trade for a guy, I would like to trade for a guy like Garrett Wilson if he's available. But then again, they got a brand new head coach now in Aaron Glenn, and I'm sure he's going to want to keep some of those guys together, the playmakers. You brought up Davante Adams. I don't know how that would work in the Broncos locker room. I don't know. Like, is Davante Adams a prima donna at this point? And we go back to what Sean Payton and Bo Nix said, we don't have a lot of prima donnas in our locker room. Greg Penner even came in and said, if you're a prima donna, you're probably not going to do well here in this situation. So for me, those would be the options. Either trade for a guy like Garrett Wilson, if he's available, or go out and try to make an aggressive push to sign Tee Higgins. I would not give up on Courtland Sutton, though. I would not get rid of him just because of the fact that, what did Bo Nix do? He developed important chemistry with him, and you certainly need that. And you need that amongst multiple guys, right? And I think sometimes Bo relied a little too much on his chemistry with Courtland, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you want to see those other guys get those opportunities to maybe spread out and have that chemistry established with one another. I think Courtland Sutton and having another wide receiver there is what is going to ultimately be the best factor for the Broncos to compete to win the AFC West. And look, I think that's where you maybe look forward thinking if you are looking at the NFL draft. There's even another name, Jeremiah Smith. Not sure he's going to be available at 20 when the Broncos pick there at Ohio State. You mentioned all those guys there from Ohio State. Smith is the one that's very intriguing because he honestly can be a joker at the wide receiver position with how he was used at Ohio State. But for me, you have to weigh the opportunity cost, right? If you were going to go younger, you need to get a playmaker that's like, all right, you have to factor in, you're either going to extend Courtland Sutton or, here in a year or two, Courtland Sutton's not going to be on the team. And now you're truly embracing the youth movement for Bo Nix as he's continuing to grow and play out on his rookie deal here in the Mile High City. That, to me, I think is where things kind of, get a little interesting. But we have seen the pipeline is there. The Broncos, they like Ohio State players. They like the University of Missouri players. They like Alabama players at this point. This wide receiver class is going to be very interesting because and obviously you can check out our good friends over there at the Locked On NFL Draft Podcast. They're doing a great job previewing everything. We got the Senior Bowl coming up as well next week. So there's so much going on, and maybe we're going to gain some more clarity. Maybe we're going to see some guys rise and fall. I wouldn't be opposed. I do think that the Broncos should add a receiver in this draft. Is it going to be round one? I don't know. It depends on what they do at running back. Depends on what they do at tight end and free agency. If those positions don't get addressed, I'm going to be very curious to see how they really approach this. But with all this, Sayre, as you and I are talking, we're outlining all these scenarios. It feels like it's kind of a good thing, too. It's bittersweet because Denver at least has options versus being it's either this or bust. Like, Denver's not in that situation here.
No, they're not, which is great to be in that type of scenario. Although I think they do have a number of avenues that they can and potentially will take that will tick off a lot of fans, because I think the fans want to see all right, let's cast our, bid for somebody like Tee Higgins, or if you don't get Tee Higgins, you better sign Chris Godwin. And if those don't happen, like, we're going to be upset with however much those guys sign for, because there's no way the Broncos can't afford that price. I mean, and it's understandable based on how many drops the Broncos had this past year. But at the same time, again, do you bank on player development? Absolutely. And the Broncos were in a unique situation this last year where they almost kind of had to rely on player development, right? I mean, nearly $90 million in dead cap. You really don't have much of a choice but to say, we're going with the young guys. Like, we're going with the rookie contract guys, and we're going to see what they can do. And I love that they did that, because maybe it provides a bit of a launching off point going forward to say, we don't need to go spend $4 million on Josh Reynolds. We don't need to go spend X million on, whatever other guys you want to kind of name from any group like that. We can bank on drafting and developing guys within the first couple of years. And I think that's I do think that we will see that this year. I think we're going to see this team developing and banking on Troy Franklin, Marvin Mims, Devaughn Vele. Maybe in the NFL draft, you get somebody like, I know he's not the exact archetype of a Sean Payton receiver, but like Tez Johnson, who has chemistry with Bo Nix already. Is his little brother, right? Played with him at Oregon, things like that. Or you go after somebody that David Shaw really liked when he was working with Stanford in the Pac-12 and things like that, or somebody that he recruited, somebody that has ties within the organization already. I don't know. I just feel like that's kind of the route that we're going to see. So not to pour cold water on the Tee Higgins idea or the blockbuster trade ideas, because I think they are possible. I just think it's more likely right now the Broncos will go with in-house player development and see if these guys can't take that next step in 2025.
Broncos Country, we want to hear from you. Send in your thoughts on how the Broncos should approach the wide receiver position here going into the offseason here in 2025. But that'll wrap up today's episode of the show. Once again, thanks to all the everydayers, first listeners out there in Broncos Country for making the show exactly what it is. If you want to know what you're going to get on tomorrow's episode of the show, our position overview series is going to continue, and it's one of the bigger positions the Broncos need to address here this offseason, tight end. How can they grow from it, and who are some options that they should heavily consider? We'll take a look at that and much more on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.